I'll do
Um, yeah, not to be confused with FIAP, the European organisation. Yes, for about 4 or 5 years, I was on the board of the Photographic Society of America, first as the International Relationships Vice President and then as the Membership Vice President. I'm not on the board now. I'm just the PSA's Membership Director for Australia. So for those of you who don't know, I live in Australia. I live in a town called, or a city called Newcastle, which is about 100 miles north of Sydney. So hopefully you'll understand my accent. I can understand most of you from your chat. So thanks for asking me to talk to you today.
So it's PSA. PSA
yeah,
you were involved with.
That's right. Yeah.
I was looking at that last night. Do you have to pay your membership to enter the exhibitions?
No, when you enter international exhibitions, you have to pay fees to enter the exhibitions. But
yeah.
If those exhibitions are recognised by PSA, then the acceptances you gain can be used towards PSA distinctions,
right.
photographic distinctions. You have to be a member of PSA in order to apply for distinctions from PSA, but you can use acceptances that you gained before you joined PSA to contribute towards your PSA distinctions.
Okay.
If you gain those acceptances within 1 year of joining PSA, there's no extra fees involved. If you want to claim acceptances from further back than 1 year, there is a fee that you pay. It's called a buyback fee to allow you to use those earlier acceptances. But I'm happy to talk to your. I'm happy to talk to your club about PSA on some other occasion if you like.
Sure.
Right, what
okay.
I'm going to do, Roy, is I'm going to mute everybody, and then if you unmute, and then you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm muting everybody now.
Yeah.
Okay, Roy, if you unmute yourself.
Okay. Yeah, my main interest is nature photography, although I do photograph other things as well. Basically, I've been interested in photography for all of my life since I was a child, like probably some of you. Started off with a Brownie box camera. My passion for photography increased considerably after I retired, which was about 15 years ago. And I've travelled and photographed a lot within Australia, but also internationally. Mainly, the place I've been to most is Africa. I lived in South Africa twice for 6 months at a time, so I've got a great passion for wildlife photography in Africa. Been entering international exhibitions since about 2008. Got addicted to that. Anyway, enough about me. You can ask some more questions later if you want. I'm going to start the presentation now, and every perhaps 10 minutes or so, I'll stop for questions if there's something that anyone wants to clarify. So I'll start the screen share now. So you should be seeing that. George, can you just thumbs up if you can see?
Yeah, we can see.
Yes, I've got your front screen.
Right. Right. Okay, here we go. Any of you who've been entering international exhibitions would know that back in 2015, FIAP and PSA, and at that stage, the Royal Photographic Society, all agreed on a common definition for nature photography. Prior to that, the three organisations had different definitions, which was a bit confusing for people entering exhibitions. So there's a common definition, and I'll be making reference to that as I go through tonight. I've put watch this space because that definition is likely to change slightly in the next 6 months. Basically, just to for those of you who are familiar with it, it's a simplification of the wording rather than a change of the direction of the definition. Now, in addition to a definition of what nature photography is for the purposes of exhibitions, there's a basic principle that the Photographic Society of America has been pushing very strongly for the last couple of years, and that's this principle. And this has become necessary because of an explosion almost of unethical practices in nature photography in terms of the images that get entered in exhibitions. So the basic idea behind that principle is that you shouldn't do anything at all that harms a living organism in any way. And by a living organism, I don't just mean birds and animals and so on. I'm talking about insects and reptiles and plants, and anything that's living shouldn't be injured or harmed or stressed and definitely not killed. And a couple of the practices that PSA is trying to eliminate specifically are baiting, particularly baiting of subjects with something that's alive, and removing birds from nests simply so that you can photograph them. And also PSA does not allow the use of drones for nature photography unless you're photographing landscapes. PSA doesn't allow the use of drones for photographing any living creatures. Now, when we come to nature competitions in exhibitions, the PSA FIAP nature definition makes a distinction between nature and wildlife. And it's a pretty simple distinction. And anything that's in a specifically wildlife competition has to be living free and unrestrained in its natural environment or an adopted environment. I won't be mentioning wildlife much tonight. You can most of the images you'll see will be wildlife images, but because everything else in the definition applies to both, I won't keep repeating it. It's important to understand that nature photography basically can take place anywhere. It doesn't have to be in exotic places like Africa or the Arctic or wherever. And everything I say to you tonight applies equally regardless of where you're doing your photography. I just use these two examples, the frogs taken in my own backyard and the birds taken just a few kilometres from where I live. Now, in terms of the nature definition, it's quite a lengthy definition. It's about an A4 page long, but it's really concerned with just three things. Subject matter, in other words, what can you photograph and still call it a nature image? Under which circumstances can you take those photographs? And that's particularly important when we're distinguishing between nature and wildlife. And the really important one for those who are entering competitions is what can you do with your images after you've captured them? What modifications or editing or changes to the image are allowed and what's not allowed? Now, as far as the subject matter is concerned, if you're going to put an image in a nature competition, you've got to say, look at your image very carefully and see whether or not there's anything in the image that's not permitted by the nature definition. It doesn't mean you haven't got a decent photograph. It simply means you might have a photograph that's not suited to a nature competition. Now, the things that are not allowed, or the things that you have to be careful about in terms of not being allowed, come into three different categories. As far as the animals are concerned, some animals are prohibited in nature competitions. Any domestic or domesticated animals, feral animals, mounted or preserved animals. Some people try to get away with animals that have been stuffed. So you can't, for example, have your favorite cat or dog. You can't have any of these, farm animals or domesticated animals. So those things are just, if any of these appear in a nature image, it's automatically disqualified in an international exhibition. And this gets a bit tricky, or some people don't quite understand it. This is a photograph of some wild horses taken in Australia in an area called the Snowy Mountains. We refer to these animals as brumbies. Now, they're obviously not native to Australia. These are the descendants of horses that were at one stage domestic horses. So they're referred to as feral animals, and they're not allowed. In America, you have a similar thing. They call them mustangs over there. And these wild horses are not allowed in nature competitions either. Basically, all the horses in the world are descended from domestic animals or animals that were domestic or domesticated at some stage. Some debate about the Przewalski horses, but apart from that, you won't see, or you shouldn't see, any horses in nature competitions. As far as plants are concerned, there are some plants that are prohibited. And basically, they're any plant which is a hybrid, a human-produced hybrid, or any plant that's cultivated. So you can't have your favourite garden flowers in a nature competition, and you can't have any cultivated crop. Like, for example, all the cereal crops are cultivated. So images such as the one you're seeing there of the canola are simply not allowed. Now, the one that gets most people into trouble in nature competitions are what the definition refers to as human elements. And a human element is anything that's either been created by humans or modified by humans. And these things are allowed in nature under just 3 circumstances. The first situation is if these human elements are in a scene where you're photographing a natural disaster, like a hurricane or a tsunami or something like that. And that's okay. It's all right to have images which show scientific bands or tags on birds, for example, or scientific radio collars on wild animals. They're okay. The most common situation is where there's something in the image which doesn't fit either of the first 2 categories, but the human element is what's referred to in the definition as an integral part of the nature story. And I'm going to explain that in more detail. So here, for example, we've obviously got some scientific banding on these birds. That's okay, it's not a problem. The image is still a legitimate nature image. Or a tag, such as on the vulture here, that's okay, it's not a problem. Now, here's an example of something which is obviously a human element, the brick wall, but the brick wall is considered to be integral to this nature story in the sense that the image is showing how the mud wasp has taken advantage of the brick wall being there, and it's building its nest in that situation. And so if the brick wall wasn't there, the wasp wouldn't be there, the nest wouldn't be there, there would be no nature story. So that type of situation is okay in a nature image. A common one is a situation where you've got a bird sitting on a fence or a post or something like that. Now, it used to be that judges would look at images like this and say, disqualified because of the fence. However, judges who know what they're looking at will recognize the fact that this bird is taking advantage of the fence because it gives it elevation above the ground, and it's there in its mating colors and doing a mating call. It's taking advantage of the fence in order to get height to try and attract a mate. So in that case, if the fence wasn't there, the bird would not be there, and so the nature story would not be there. So that's okay. Here's an example, an image taken in Southern Africa, where this huge structure here is actually a whole collection of nests built by these little birds, which you can just see here perhaps, called communal weavers. And they build these huge nests. Now, obviously, the nest is built on a dead tree, and you can't see any human elements anywhere in the image, so that's fine. But where you see these nests, you'll also see images like this, where the birds have built the nest on top of a telegraph pole or a electrical wire pole, whichever the case may be. Again, we have a situation where this is just illustrating that the birds have taken advantage of this human structure because there's nowhere else to build their nest. If you have a look around the landscape here, there aren't any trees like this where they can build their nests. So they've taken advantage of the human structure. So the human structure in this case is an integral part of the nature story. And so that's okay, no problem. We've got a totally different situation here. We've obviously got human elements in the background, these drums. The drums have got absolutely nothing to do with the seeker deer bounding through the snow. So the nature story here of the deer in that environment going through the snow is not connected in any way with the human elements. The human elements, if you like, are incidental. Take them away, you've still got the deer in the snow. So in that case, that image would not be allowed in a nature competition. Likewise, this situation, we certainly have a story. It's a story of how these macaques in Japan will interact with the tourists or the photographers who go there to photograph them, but it's not actually a nature story. So in that case, that sort of image is not allowed in nature. In nature competitions, landscapes are allowed, but in this situation, it's not just the landscape, but we've got people and we've got a staircase, and these things, the human element of the staircase and the humans themselves, are not related at all to the nature story, which is being told by the rock formation. So that sort of image would not be allowed in a nature competition. Now, in this case, this is actually a photograph of a river, believe it or not. Well, a river bed anyway. This bottom part of the image is a dry riverbed in the Kalahari area of Southern Africa. And I took this image to illustrate 2 points. One was the fact that this is what the river looks like, and you only get water in it once every 70 years. So it's pretty dry. But notice up on top of the hill, we've got this little structure up here, a human structure. It's very small in the image, but it's got nothing to do with the story about the landscape. And so that image, just on the basis of that tiny little thing up there, would be disqualified in a nature competition. So to help you understand this idea of what is or is not allowed in a nature image in terms of human elements, things made by humans, you can think of it this way. Look at the image and say, well, if I took that human element away, is the nature story still going to be there? And if the answer is no, which, for example, was the case with the mud wasp and the brick wall, take away the brick wall, there is no nature story there. Therefore, the image is okay as a nature image. But if we think about that last image of the landscape, take away that little structure on top of the hill, it doesn't change the nature story about the landscape. Therefore, the image is not allowed as a nature image. I'll just pause there briefly to see if there are any questions at this stage. If you've got a question, just press your space bar and you can talk.
So that image of the dried up river, is the person allowed to edit out the tower or whatever it was and then enter?
Absolutely not. I'll come to that aspect of modifying the images later, but absolutely not. If you just took the healing brush or the cloning tool or whatever and got rid of that structure, then you're classified as a cheat.
Could you just reiterate again what the difference, the principal difference is? You said at the beginning, the wildlife and the nature.
Well, in the nature definition allows photographs of animals or birds and so on that are in captivity, whereas the wildlife definition says that the creature has to be living free and unrestrained in its.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Right.
So, for example, if you took a photograph of an animal in a zoo that were providing certain other conditions are met, it would be allowed in nature, but not wildlife.
Right, just going back to the brumbies. If there was a brumbie running across the back and there were two eagles dueling in the sky, would the fact that those brumbies or that Brumby was there, would that negate that photograph because it was a captive animal or an escapee animal that had become wild?
Yes.
So you couldn't
Yes,
use
it would.
that photograph in wildlife, even
No,
though there's a
you could.
story in the sky that, you know, is
You couldn't. You
dramatic.
couldn't use that image in wildlife or nature unless you cropped the image so that you couldn't see the wild horse. Yep. It's a fairly strict definition, and I'll later on I'll give you a reference to where you can see. You can download a very detailed set of guidelines that judges are required to use when they judge nature images. Okay, I'll go back to sharing. Okay, here's where I'll answer the question about removing that little object that was in the landscape. The definition is quite specific about what editing can be done to nature images. And this is the basic principle. Essentially what it means is, apart from cropping, you have to present the image as captured in terms of its content. So with that landscape image, for example, that had the little structure on top of the hill, if I take that structure out by cloning or some other means, I've changed the truth of what I captured as the photograph. So this just expands on that idea. You can't move things around in the image, you can't take things out, you can't put extra things in unless you're just cropping. And regardless of what you do to your nature images, in terms of the adjustments that are allowed, which I'll look at in a moment, the end result still has to look natural. So if you look at an image and you think, oh, hang on a minute, here we've got a photograph of a nice bird, but the colors don't look natural, it's oversaturated, for example, then that's not acceptable. So these are the things that you can do when you're editing nature images. And the one I mentioned before is cropping. That's not a problem. You can make tonal adjustments to the image to try to create an image that looks as close as possible to what you believe you saw at the time. You can sharpen the images, but don't over sharpen them. You can use noise reduction techniques. And a couple of ones that you might think initially are controversial. You can use exposure blending. In other words, you can take a series of images, say 2 or 3 images of exactly the same thing, but using different exposures. So you have one underexposed, one overexposed, and one close to correct exposure, and you can blend those together. That's allowed because basically it's simply taking care of the fact that your camera, no matter how good it is going to be able to capture only a limited range of light. And so if the scene has really dark areas or really light areas or both, you can compensate for that with exposure blending. And likewise, you can use focus stacking, and I'll demonstrate what that is later if you're not sure what it is. But essentially, focus stacking is just taking care of the fact that there will be a limitation to how much depth of field you can get with a single image. So a few examples. If you take an image like that and you think, well, okay, I like the image, I like what's happening here in the center of the image, but I've got this bright area in the sky over here to the right, which is a bit of a distraction. It's quite okay to crop the image. That's absolutely permitted. If you take this and think, well, it's not quite what I remember it being, you can make tonal adjustments to the image like that. Still looking natural, so it's still okay. But you've got to be careful when you're making these adjustments, because of the fact that the image still has to look natural at the end. So you definitely got to be careful that you don't fiddle with the colors and oversaturate the images, or put too much contrast in them, or over sharpen them. They're the 3 most common errors that I see when judging nature competitions. And most definitely don't add textures or vignettes to your nature images. They're definitely not allowed. So by way of example, if you took that image and you thought, well, it's sort of okay, but it needs a little bit more contrast, you could give it a little bit more contrast, a little bit more sharpening. So we're just going from that to that. But if you went overboard and created that, it's no longer a nature image, just an ugly image. If you photograph the gull like that and you think, oh, I'd like to sharpen it up a bit, and you take the sharpening too far, then that's not permitted either. And of course, the giveaway with over sharpening is always the halos along the edges, or usually the halos along the edges. You can't add a vignette. So if you took that image and you thought, oh, I like it, but maybe it'll look better with the vignette, and you did that, that would not be allowed as a nature image, simply because the darkening of the corners of the image makes it look unnatural. That's not what I saw when I took that photograph. Also, blurring of the background, it can be a problem. It's okay to use noise reduction. So if you had that image and you looked at it carefully and you could see that there was a bit of noise in the background, it's okay to reduce the noise so long as you don't take it too far. If you blur the background like that, it's no longer permitted as a nature image. Again, because it doesn't look natural. Another thing that is allowed is flipping of your images horizontally. So if you took that image and you thought, well, I like it, but it would look better that way, obviously not presenting both of them one at a time. If you like the right-hand image better than the left-hand image, you are allowed to do that because you're not changing the content of the image. This is just equivalent to the old days when we used to accidentally drop a slide in the projector back the front. So that would be okay. An example of exposure blending. If I'm wanting to photograph the spider and I took these 4 images all at slightly different exposures, you can see the big difference obviously between the one up here in the top corner and the one in the bottom corner. I could take those 4 exposures, it's exactly the same content in each situation. I could blend them together to get that result. And that would be permitted, no problem with that. Now with focus stacking, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, the content of this image is not allowed in nature because it's a cultivated plant, but assuming that it was a suitable subject, if I took the first photograph where I focused in to that plane, so I'm focusing basically on this point of the flower because it's the closest point to the camera. And then I took another photograph where I'd focused a little bit deeper into the image, and then another photograph where I focused deeper into the image, and so on, and took a whole series of photographs like that, so that the last photograph I'm taking, I'm focused on this point back here. I can then use software to combine those images so that everything appears to be in focus, or everything is in focus. And this particular one, I took 17 different images and I stacked them together in a program called Helicon Focus. You can do focus stacking in Photoshop, and there are other programs available for doing it as well. So you can use that technique, and you can use it with things like flowers. You can use it for landscapes as well, so that you get everything in the landscape from really close to the camera to the great distance away in focus. So focus stacking is permitted. Just to see if there are any questions at this stage.
I think everybody's happy, Roy.
I've got an idea. How do you, you showed that, I think it was a hyena, and you blurred the background.
Yes.
How would you determine between that as a blurred background and one shot with a short depth of field to blur the background?
Basically, just by looking very carefully at the image, you can usually tell if the background's been blurred artificially. And I mean, it's a judgment call, and some people would look at a particular image and say, yes, that's taken naturally, and others might look at it and say, well, no, it's not. But the main issue that I come across as a judge is people who will blur the background to the extent that there's absolutely no detail in the background at all. And again, sometimes you can get that in a single shot, and I'll show you an example of that later on. And it's a matter of the knowledge and experience of the judge, basically. Yeah.
Roy, you've not mentioned anything about blemishes, removing blemishes.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's okay. If you've got, for example, dust spots on your sensor, it's quite okay to remove those. Yeah. Yeah. Because that's, you're not, in that sense, you're not changing the truth of what you captured. You're just taking care of the fact that you were clumsy and let dust get on your sensor. Okay, I'll continue. Am I talking too fast for you?
No, you're doing
No.
fine, Roy.
Oh, it's great. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go back to the share then. Okay, now I've just talked about some things that you can do, like cropping, and now here are some things that you cannot do when you're editing your nature images. And a basic principle is this: don't change the nature story, don't change the truth of what you captured. So anything that is changing content, putting something in, taking something out, moving it around, those things are just not allowed. And also techniques that combine two images in some way are not allowed unless it's the exposure blending I talked about previously, or the focus stacking. When it comes to stitching images, in other words, taking two images that you took side by side and put them together to make a panorama type image, at the present time, that is not allowed. It might be allowed perhaps later this year when the nature definition is modified slightly. So if I had those two images and stitched them together to create the image you see at the bottom, currently that would not be allowed. I'm anticipating it will be allowed in future, because just as I said with exposure blending, it's taking care of limitation of your camera. Likewise, focus stacking is taking care of a limitation in terms of depth of field. You can look at stitched images as simply compensating for the fact that a particular lens has a limited field of view. And what you see in this stitched image is still a truthful representation of what was in the two images at the top. So that might change in future. Okay, an example here of not being able to remove something. If you had this image and you thought, well, I like the image, but there's a bit of rubbish here in the background, and particularly this dark spot, it's drawing a bit of attention away from the bird, I'll just get rid of it. I mean, it's easy enough to get rid of it, but it's not permitted because the second image is no longer a truthful representation of what you captured. Even something like this, if you think, okay, I like the image, but it was really inconvenient that this blade of grass came across the lion's eye, I'll just get rid of it. It's easy enough to do, just one stroke with the healing brush. And you might say, well, how's the judge who looks at this image going to know that I took out that blade of grass? And the answer is the judge will probably, whoever it is probably never going to know because they haven't seen the original image. But the point is, you as the photographer, you as the person who edited the image, know that you changed the image. You know that you did something that's not permitted. So slap yourself on the wrist and don't do it. The other extreme, you can't put things in the image that weren't there to start with. So you might look at that and say, oh, I like it, but gee, it'd be much better with a few more elephants in it. No, sorry, you can't do that. It's no longer a nature image. You might do it for, put it in an open competition, but it's no longer a nature image. Likewise, you can't duplicate things that are in the image. So you take the photo of the vulture and say, well, gee, I like that, but oh, it'd be a whole lot better if there were more of them. No, sorry, you can't do that. It's just not permitted. you can't replace something. In other words, take something out of the image and put something else in its place. So if you had an image like this and you thought, oh, well, I like what the eagles are doing, but that sky is awful. I'll replace the sky. Wow, much prettier image, but it's no longer a nature image. You can't combine two images in any way other than what I mentioned before. So you photograph the grey hornbill, you photograph a nice sunset, you think, well, okay, we'll create something that's a combination of the two. That's fine, but not as a nature image. This one, it took me ages to train that mouse. Well, actually, no. The mouse was in my backyard at home. The lion was in Africa. You can't do that. It's definitely not a nature image. And also, you're not allowed to use clip art in your images. Not for anything, not just nature, but not for anything. So you can't put images like this in nature. You can create them and put them in open competitions, but our local koala can't qualify as a nature image. Any questions at this stage? Okay, we'll go back to sharing. Okay, monochrome images are permitted in nature, provided they are grayscale monochrome images, black and white if you like. You can't have toned images in nature. You can't make your nature image a sepia tone or something else. It's just not allowed in the definition. And likewise, infrared images. You can't have infrared images in nature, regardless of whether you captured them with an infrared camera or you made the image look as though it was an infrared image by using some Photoshop process, for example. And associated with these things is you can't partially desaturate your images to make them look a bit artistic. So you could have an image like that, which is straight grayscale monochrome, that's okay. But you couldn't have an image like that, where you're trying to create the idea perhaps that you took this shot in the moonlight or something. It's a toned image, which is not allowed. Likewise, you can't have an infrared image such as this. Lots of people don't like the idea that you can't have infrared images, but the people who wrote the definition basically took the view that infrared images don't quite look natural and therefore they're not allowed. And if you have an image like that, you can't partially desaturate it, make it, think, okay, the bird would be prettier if it was paler. You can't do that, or you can't take it to an extreme like this where you've turned part of the image into monochrome and left part of it as color. Those sorts of things, if you want to play around with those, by all means do it, but put it in an open competition. And something to keep in mind, even though the nature definition allows you to have grayscale images, what I come across over and over again when I'm judging is that sometimes people don't recognize the fact that the color is a really important part of the nature story. If you take the color out, you can quite often reduce the power of the story you're trying to tell. And I also see this quite a lot, where people have an image that's got some obvious faults in it and they think, geez, if I turn it to monochrome, that'll hide the faults. Generally doesn't work. The nature definition specifically addresses the issue of the technical standard of your image, and the wording of the definition says this: nature images should be high technical quality. Now, we could argue all day about what high technical quality is, but most people can recognize that if they see an image which has got technical problems. And essentially, particularly if you're entering international competitions, but I would suggest even just at the club level or inter-club level, if your image has a serious technical fault, you can see it there yourself. You can guarantee other people are going to see it. So basically, you're wasting your time entering it. Now, if you want images which are of a high technical quality, you've got to understand how to get them, how to capture them in the first place, and how to process them so that you preserve that quality. And this is an image I put in to also illustrate the point we were talking about before about a blurred background. Now, if you look at that image, the question becomes, is it an as captured image, or has the background rather been artificially blurred? Now, in this case, that image was taken on a crop sensor camera that had a 300mm lens on it, so it's roughly equivalent to a 350mm lens. It was taken at f8. Now, the question is, why f8? And it's because I wanted to get depth of field which would keep the weaver bird and the beginnings of its nest in focus, and that pretty well achieved that from the eye of the bird back to the tail. I took it at a 3,000th of a second. Now you think, why would you take it at such a high speed? The bird's going to be moving, obviously, because it's doing a bit of weaving here, but is it moving that fast? And the answer is yes. That high speed was used because you can see this is a very thin branch. The bird's moving vigorously, so that's causing the branch to move. And also it was windy, so there was a lot of movement going on there. So that was why the shutter speed had to be so high. So having those things in mind, I'm sort of trying to instantly process what camera settings do I need in order to capture the quality I'm after. The blurred background here comes about by virtue of the fact that I'd positioned myself so that there was nothing close in the background. This background was actually about 100 meters away. It was trees in the very distant background. Now, the aperture and shutter speed settings in this situation meant that I had to be using an ISO of 1600 in order to be able to use the other two settings. And lots of people get frightened about using high shutter speed, high ISO settings, because they've been told always use the lowest possible ISO setting, have ISO 100 if you can, and so on. I'm going to address that a little bit later on. So if you understand your equipment and what you need to do to capture the good technical quality, that's the starting point. Common problems that I see people coming across or are encountering when they taking nature shots is focus. Now, if you don't nail the focus, if it's a bird or animal, make sure you've got the eye in focus, because that's the first thing we look at. Depth of field is a very, very common problem. And I'm going to talk about that a bit more in a moment. And exposure, particularly getting it right when you're photographing something that's where the subject is both light and dark, like a bird, a black and white bird, for example. It's a challenge to get detail in both the white feathers and the black feathers. So they're the three most common problems that you have to deal with in order to get the basic good high technical quality. And these are things that you have to deal with at the time you're capturing the image. Don't rely on being able to fix them up later. So here's just an example of an image where depth of field is a problem. This is a tiny little spider. They're about 0.5 centimeter long. And obviously the camera was focused on these legs at the front. And so doesn't take, the depth doesn't have to go back very far before we're out of focus. So an image like that, you've got to put it down to experience and say, hang on, I didn't think carefully enough about depth of field when I was taking this photograph. And it's important to keep this in mind. When we're talking about depth of field, most people say, oh, okay, depth of field, aperture, that's the issue. Yes, but depth of field is also influenced by the focal length of the lens that you're using and by the distance from that the subject is from the camera. So you have to be mentally taking these three things into account to get adequate depth of field, not just aperture. Exposure issues, just use this to illustrate an aperture, sorry, not an aperture problem, an exposure problem. I'm photographing a bird here which has got very white feathers here, and basically darkish, quite dark feathers on the head. If this is just an enlarged shot of it, so you can see the issue more clearly. Now, in this case, the camera did a reasonable job because the image was shot as a RAW file, not a JPEG file. It's possible, in this case, using Lightroom, to adjust the exposure to bring back some of the detail here, and also bring back some of the detail, the very light detail that was in the bird at the front. So we finish up with an image where the exposure looks okay and the image still looks natural. Any questions? I know that for some of you, I'll be telling you how to suck eggs with some of this stuff, but there'll be some other points that you might not be fully aware of.
I'm finding it very interesting, Roy.
I'll keep going then.
We all like to have a refresher now and again.
Okay, well, I'll keep going. Okay, now, most of the challenge of nature photography obviously takes place while you're on location, wherever that might be, your backyard or Africa or wherever. And one thing that I keep emphasizing every time I talk about nature photography is you've got to be thinking all the time about how you can capture a good, strong nature story, not just a pretty picture. To get that, you're going to have to be patient. Yeah, I know as we get older, our patience sometimes dwindles, but you've got to be patient, got to be prepared to sit and wait. I think the most extreme case I had was waiting 5 hours to photograph a lion in Africa, but that's another story. You've certainly got to make the most of every opportunity that you come across. I've seen it over and over again where people come across a situation where there is the potential to take good nature photographs, and they take one or two and then they pack up and leave. And I think, well, why are you going? Just crazy. And certainly ignore the advice that says only shoot at dawn and dusk. Yeah, sure, the light might be great at those times, but if that's all the shooting you do, particularly if you're away from home, you're going to miss out on a lot of opportunities. And just as an aside here, I don't know how many of you have ever been on organised photographic tours to Africa or Antarctica or wherever, but I've only ever been on 2. And what happened to me on those 2 tours was pretty much what happens, I believe, in most cases. The tour guides determine how long you can be in a particular location photographing whatever it is. And it's most likely if you go somewhere like Africa, they'll tell you, we've got to be up early, go out, photograph in the morning, then we'll come back to the accommodation and we'll sit down and have a cup of coffee and chat for the next 5 hours, and then we'll go out again. You miss so many opportunities in those situations that it's just crazy. When I've been to Africa 35 times, and with 2 exceptions, in Africa with 1 exception, I guide myself, if you like to put it that way. I drive myself around, and I am photographing from dawn till dusk, not just at dawn and dusk, but all day long. And you've got to keep this in mind. Don't be too quick to take your photographs. By all means, you come across something interesting, take a couple of shots so you've got a record of it in case it all disappears really quickly. But then you've got to start thinking, how do I get a good image, not just an image? It's no use coming back from a day's shooting saying, wow, I'm really clever. I took 5,000 photos today. Okay, of those 5,000 photos, how many are worth keeping? If you're going to delete 4,900 of them, you might as well have only taken 100 in the first place. So now we come to the really most important part of what I say today. it's emphasized in the nature definition. This is a quote from the nature definition. The storytelling value of your image is the most important thing. Your nature images must tell a nature story. And I'm going to give you a little help here to determine whether or not your image is telling a good story. So imagine that we're just photographing a living creature, a bird, an animal, insect, whatever it might be. At a basic level, you can take a photograph which will show you, which is basically just a descriptive photograph. It shows you what the creature looks like. Here's a bird. You can tell roughly how big it is. This is what shape it is. These are the colors on the bird and so on. At the next level of story, you're showing me not just the descriptive aspect of the bird, but you're giving me some insight into what the bird does, its behavior, its life cycle, and so on. And that can be as simple as, here's the bird and it's eating something, so we can tell what it's eating and hopefully where it got the food and so on. At the next level, you've got an image which shows not just one bird, but two birds that are interacting with one another in some way, or two creatures that are interacting with one another. And it might be the parent and the young one. It might be a whole group of birds that are interacting in some way. But we've gone from just here's one bird and what it does to here's a group of birds and what they do. And then we get to the next level of story where the interaction is between creatures of two different species. Here's the predator, here's its prey, here's how they're interacting. Or it might be creatures of two different species that are fighting over food, or you might be showing some sort of a symbiotic relationship between different creatures. So you're getting a more and more complex story all the time. Now, if you can add to that information about where this is taking place, the habitat, the environment that it's all happening in, you're getting an even stronger story. So basically, this is one way of looking at what's a weak nature story through to what is a strong nature story. Now, it's a fairly basic way of looking at it, and an alternative interpretation of the same idea is this. We've got a static subject, bird sitting on a stick. It's a descriptive story. We've got an image that shows some sort of typical behavior. We've got an image that might be showing some sort of unusual behavior or atypical behavior. We've got same species interactions. We've got different species interacting. And so this is a slightly different way of looking at the idea of going from a weak to a strong nature story. So I'll show you some examples of that. Images like this are basically just descriptive, particularly the image here on the left. It's not telling us anything at all other than this is what the bird, and in this case, just the head of the bird, looks like. So, you know, it's a pretty picture, but it's not much of a nature story. Virtually every nature image you capture is going to have an element of this descriptive stuff in it. Now, this image up here of the rainbow lorikeet, we're going just a tiny bit further than description. Here, at least, we're seeing basically the full bird rather than just its head, but it's still a very, very basic nature story. Similar thing here. The image is giving us a description of the bird, nothing more. Whereas even something as simple as this, we've gone a tiny bit further. This image is showing or giving us the description of the red-winged blackbird, but it's also demonstrating its typical mating behavior. It gets on the little twig like this and it calls out and fans its tail out and puffs its wings out. So we're getting more of a nature story in the image on the right than what we have on the left. An image like this, we can look at that and say, pictorially, it's a very nice image. The lighting is really beautiful and it's showing us the details of the black-backed jackal and so on. So it's good from that point of view, but as a nature story, it's extremely basic. An image like this goes a little bit further. we've got the descriptive aspect of the bird here, but we can see now, all right, these look like the legs of a buffalo, which they are. So we start to get the story about these birds that follow the buffalo around, and the buffalo disturbs the insects and the bird catches the insect. So we're starting to get a bit of a nature story in it. An image like this, the saddle-billed stork, basically description. It's telling us, yeah, okay, the stork's in the water, so it's probably there looking for food. But although it's a nice image, the story, the nature story, is still not very strong. If you're in a situation like that, where you can take that image, it's what I was saying before, you've got to be patient, you've got to take advantage of the situation. So even if you just wait for that to happen, we're starting to get a more interesting image, because now we're getting a little bit more of a descriptive story. We can now see what's happening underneath the wings of the bird. So we've got a little bit more description than before, and we get some idea of how the bird moves around in the water. Still quite a weak nature story, but better than the bird just standing there. We come to something like this. We're now getting a story about the typical behavior of this little whistling rat. We can see a little bit of the environment. We can see it's a very sandy environment, so it's probably desert area, which it is. We can see that the rat's in a hole, so it's probably dug a little burrow. We get some idea of what it's eating. So we're starting to build up a slightly stronger nature story. Now, in this image, we've got a raptor called a secretary bird from Africa. And this image is telling us that, okay, this bird is in fairly long grass, because if you know anything about the bird, you know that it's got very long legs. Its legs from where the black starts here down to the ground, at least 1/2 meter, very long legs. And if you know something about the bird, and it's really important to understand something of the behavior of the things you're photographing, you know that this bird, its favorite food is snakes. It's in the long grass. It's probably looking for snakes. It's got its wings out. It's probably seen a snake in the grass. And so a lot of that story is implied. In that situation, again, patience, wait, and with a bit of luck, you start to get images like this, where we can not only see that the secretary bird's after a snake, but that it's doing battle with this snake. Image like this is simply showing typical mating behavior of these crested terns. So the story there is about typical mating behavior, and even though the background's out of the focus, we get some idea of the context in which this is taking place on a beach. If you go to Africa, first line you see, you'll photograph it and think that's wonderful, and it may be, but you want to look for images that are not just a pretty picture of the lion. In this case, the story goes a little bit further because we can see the lion's wet, so it's probably been in the rain, but it's still not a particularly strong nature story. An image like this, whilst it's not quite so good technically, it's telling us a much stronger story. It's telling the story of the interaction between what's most likely the father and the young lion. So we're starting to get more of a story. Similar sort of thing here. The story is about the interaction between the cub and its mother. So we're starting to build up a stronger nature story each time. Similar sort of thing here. We've got the story about the lioness capturing the food and sharing it with the cubs. So, and finally, a lion shot here. We've got the story about how this juvenile lion is thinking it's clever and trying to catch the birds. So you can see that it's not just a matter of finding a creature and photographing it. You've got to think about, what story can I tell with my image? And it's really important with nature stories, or trying to capture nature stories, to keep in mind that what somebody else sees when they look at your image is just the fraction of a second in time that you captured. They don't know what came before or after the image that you show them. Whereas when you look at your own image, it's like a video starts in your head. You replay the whole situation. And so when I look at this image, I know where that young lion came from. I know what happened when he tried to catch the birds, and that can color my interpretation of the image. So try to get your images to tell their story as strongly as possible to somebody who wasn't there at the time. Okay, image like this, we've got the goshawk in a tree. Great. Okay, you might take that and say, well, I'm happy with that. I've got good clarity and so on. Yes, but be patient. Think, why is the goshawk there? Well, it's probably up there because it's looking for some food. They get most of their food off the ground, so it's probably looking for mice or something on the ground. And you know that if you're a bit patient, it's not going to be long before it takes off. And as you get the takeoff, you get a much more interesting image than you had when it was just sitting there doing nothing or sitting there looking around. If you're unlucky enough to come across two goshawks, recognize they're juveniles. Like juveniles of many, many creatures, both birds and mammals and so on, juveniles tend to fight with one another. It's like brother and sister in a human household. So wait for them to fight. You get a much stronger image if they're fighting rather than just sitting there beside one another. You come across a nice yellow-billed hornbill. And in this case, it's sitting on a branch which is relatively low to the ground. You've got to think to yourself, what's it doing there? Why is it just sitting there? What's it going to do next? And you know, if you understand the creatures, you know that they feed on the ground. So you know before long it's going to jump down off the stick and it's going to be foraging around in the grass looking for food. And you'll also know the food they get is quite often ants. So you be patient. You might have to wait 10 minutes, but eventually it will catch an ant and it'll be kind enough to throw the ant up in the air before it swallows it. And so you get an image like this, which is obviously a much stronger nature story than either of the two images that I just showed you. Likewise, you see this bird in this position, you know it's looking for food. You know, if you understand the bird, the food is probably fish. So you wait and it'll cooperate and catch a fish for you. You see images like these ibis, which happen to be fairly common in the area where I live. They're in a wetland area and you have opportunities for taking lots of images like this where basically they're not doing much at all. Preening itself, about to scratch its ear, not doing much. But if you go at the right time of year, there'll be young ibis, juvenile ibis, and you're able to get images like this where the parent is feeding the almost fully grown juvenile. And so you've got a much stronger nature story, a much more interesting image than what you will get with the other two that I just showed you. Back to weaver birds. Now, this is a different image to what you saw before, but taken under similar circumstances in a similar sort of situation. But in order to take full advantage of a situation like this, you take your images like this, but then you think to yourself, okay, what's the bird doing? It started to build its nest. What's it building it out of? It's got these strands of grass. Okay, where's it getting the grass from? Well, it's getting the grass from an area like this. And you can see it's got the grass in its mouth. So you're getting a totally different sort of image telling a different part of the story about this bird building its nest. And of course, in that situation, you don't just take a couple of photos and move on. In this particular situation, I came across the location where the weaver birds were building their nests, and they tend to do it in a sort of a communal situation. I kept coming back several times a day over about 3 days, and you get a whole range of different images then, from the early stages of the nest building to partway through to the situation where the male has completed the nest and it's trying to attract a female. They hang upside down and flutter their wings like crazy and make a lot of noise and attract the female who comes along, inspects the nest and decides if it's good enough. And this situation, after the nest is built, they then get softer material to put inside it. So you've got to be prepared to be patient and get the full story, not just part of it. Birds in flight are interesting to photograph, but with an image like this, you have to recognize, yes, it's a bird in flight, but essentially it's not going very much further than description. Here, this is what the red-crowned crane looks like when it's flying. So we're sort of second level nature story, if you like, but it's not really powerful. Whereas an image like this, you've got the descriptive part of it, spoonbill in this case, this is what it looks like when it's flying, but this is the sort of nesting material that it carries while it's flying. If you're in a situation like this, where you can photograph the bee eaters and they've caught an insect, that's great. But it's a situation like this where if your camera has the capability, you must have it on burst mode, not single shot mode. So you don't just take that one shot and clap hands and say, I've got a wonderful shot. You fire off a burst of shots, and that's going to enable you to get an image like this, which is a much more exciting image than the one we just saw. If you're in Africa and you come across some springboks, yeah, okay, pretty picture of a couple of springboks. Why do they call them springboks? Because they do this crazy stuff called plonking. You capture that typical behavior. This is another local bird for me called a water hen, and they're quite pretty birds. And yeah, okay, nice descriptive shot, but if you understand the birds and what they do, particularly around mating season, they're pretty nasty creatures. They like fighting with one another. So you try to get some of that behavior and you get a much stronger nature story in that situation. And then a little, well, maybe a month or so, or 6 weeks later, you've got the potential of getting images like this. And part of the nature story here, besides the obvious parent and the chicks and the story about what the nest is like and where it's built and so on, this is actually a juvenile from the previous year, and they help the parent to feed the chicks. If you like photographing insects, ants are good subjects for nature photography, but keep in mind, the images like these are essentially descriptive. This is what the ants look like. And from that point of view, they're not strong nature images. It's much better if you can get the ant actually doing something, like in this case, carrying a bee down a flower. We have these creatures in my local area. I don't know whether you have them in England or not. They're called paper wasps. And a shot like that, you can say, wow, look at all the detail and so on, which is fine, but basically a descriptive story. This is what it looks like. They actually build a nest like this. That's why it's called a paper wasp. This is material they get from plants. And now we've got the story, not just this is what the face of the wasp looks like, but this is the structure it builds, and it lays eggs, and the eggs start to develop and so on. And if you wait, you get more of the life cycle, because you can see now that what started off as the eggs develop, eventually each one of these individually will close itself in. And you can see that this one is currently weaving that or producing that little covering that goes over its hull. And you be patient. I photographed this particular wasp almost every day for about 3 months. It was only about a metre outside my back door. And so it was convenient to do it. But the point was, over that 3-month period, you get a whole series of images about the life cycle and telling the story, each one telling a slightly different story. Here we've got an example of a storytelling image where we've got essentially interaction between the two birds of different species. We've got the eagle that had the fish, and the crow is trying to come in and get some food, take advantage of the eagle having caught the fish. Another thing to think about when you're trying to capture nature stories is it's often best to concentrate on something specific rather than general. Here we're back in the Kalahari, and we've got another one of these dry riverbeds and all the springbok here. And it's telling a story about this huge herd and where they are, but it's very difficult to see any detail in an image like this. And so that puts a limit on the story. And similar thing here, we've got all these sandgrouse came down to the waterhole to drink. And an image like that, it's giving you a story, but it's really difficult when you look at that whole image to pick out, what does the photographer want you to concentrate on? So take a shot like that by all means, but at the time, pick a specific target, because if there's too much to take in, you've got to be selective. And in this case, you want to be selective so you can start to get images like this or like this, where the typical thing people try to capture in this situation is the muddy water dropping down as the bird takes off. And you can't, you probably don't recognize it here, but the bird actually has collected water in these chest feathers. Besides having a drink, it collects water in these chest feathers and then flies back to its young to give them the water. Okay, let's see if there's any questions at this stage.
Would you like to have a break?
Oh, I can keep going but if you want to stop now, that's fine.
What does anybody think? George, Alan, David, anybody?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind a break.
Okay, we'll take a 5-minute break then.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
It's okay with me.
Yeah, that would be great then.
It's 47 minutes to, so just after 52 minutes to will be 5 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, we'll go put the kettle.
Image. And obviously the image has to be good technical quality, which I talked about before. And if you can capture something that's a little bit different, then that will help as well, because particularly if you're entering international competitions, judges tend to see very similar images over and over again. So I'm just going to show you a few of my images now, which I think sort of satisfy these criteria. So with this one, for example, there's an obvious story. Bird has caught fish. But one of the things that makes it a little bit different is the fact that I had the camera basically at water level to capture the image, so rather than looking down on the action. This one, South African snake called a boomslang, and you might have to adjust your eyes a little bit, but what's happening is the snake is swallowing a frog, a large frog, and the frog is hanging on to the branch here. It doesn't want to go down. That was taken in the wild, not in captivity. Situation like this, we've got several layers to the nature story here. We've got these birds at the back, which are obviously looking for food and sort of ignoring the crocodile that's near them. And that's what I was actually photographing. I was interested in these birds, and then quite unexpectedly, these two crocs came into the scene and started fighting with one another. So it's an example of where you've got to be ready to take advantage of whatever comes along. Anyone who goes to Africa probably likes photographing zebra. They're very photogenic things. And if you get a little bit of interaction like this, that's a bonus, if you like. But again, in a situation like that, don't be satisfied with that. You know that if they're starting to fight with one another, they're probably going to get a little bit more excited and start doing more interesting things, like you see in this image where you've got the fight going on and the spectator here. Sometimes you get quite unusual images like this one, where obviously the the zebra had survived an attack from something, probably a lion, could have been hyenas. There were a lot of hyenas in the area where I took this, but obviously it happened a few days before. It wasn't actually bleeding, and the zebra is just having a feed, so something a little bit different. This one is a straight descriptive shot, but it's describing something that's quite unusual. This is called a quagga-like zebra, quagga being a variety of zebra that existed a long time ago and is believed to be extinct. But very occasionally, this is the only one I've ever seen, you get zebras which apparently have some of the quagga gene in them, and it causes this very unusual pattern. Come across something like this, the bull elephant taking advantage of a mud hole. And that's fine. We certainly have a story there, but again, it's a matter of being patient and waiting and hanging around for another 10 minutes, half an hour, whatever it takes, just to see if the elephant does anything more than just puddle around in the mud. And then with a bit of luck, you'll start to get something which again is just that little bit different. This is becomes a slightly more interesting image than the one we saw before. If any of you have ever been to Japan and gone to see what I referred to as the snow monkeys, actually macaques, you may well have captured an image like this yourself. We've probably seen images like this where the macaques get in the hot springs in the wintertime to warm up. And that's fine, get an image like that. But have in mind that about 10 million other people in the world have got a similar image. So if you want your image to stand out, you've got to try and get more than just that. So again, getting the interaction between two of them gives you a stronger image. And it's telling the story about the hierarchy here of grooming behavior and sort of little touches of the look of pleasure, if you like, on this one's face. But again, if you're in that situation, this sort of action occurs in a hot spring in a fairly restricted area, but it's surrounded by hills that are covered in snow. And if you're there at the right time of year, there will be not only this sort of action going on in the water, but there'll be a lot of juveniles around. And the juveniles like to fight with one another. So you look for to what they're doing, and you start to capture some images that are a little bit different, because it's not just the standard here's the macaque in the water type image. Sometimes you get really lucky in terms of capturing something that's different, like this. That is the only time I've ever seen a buffalo sharing a sandbar with a half a dozen crocodiles. And obviously when you're in that situation, you think, wow, I'm going to get some action here. So these crocodiles are going to eat that buffalo. Well, I'll tell you a little story about this. I photographed that, or an image very similar to that, at about 8 o'clock one morning in Kruger National Park in South Africa. And at that time, I just happened to be with a group of other people, and the driver moved on. He just said, we've got to go. And so later in the day, I was able to be by myself and drove back to this location with my fingers crossed, and it was still there. This is from 8 o'clock in the morning to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Essentially the same scene. I mean, the crocodiles have moved around a bit, but it was essentially the same scene. So I determined at that point I was going to stay there for as long as I possibly could to see what happened. And I was in a situation where I could stay there for 2 hours, because I had to then drive back to my accommodation and be back there in time so I wouldn't be locked out. So over a period of about 2 hours, I photographed this scene quite a lot. It was a long way away. I was using a 400mm lens, And occasionally the buffalo would stand up and the crocodiles would move around, and I'm thinking, yep, great, I'm going to get the shot now. And this went on until 5 minutes to 5 when I had to leave. And I'm just about to pack up my gear, and the buffalo got up and calmly walked away. And nothing happened. But the point was, even though I didn't get the action I was hoping for, I did get this most unusual shot. In terms of things that are a little bit unusual, this is a spider we have, well, in my backyard. We get these spiders in the backyard. It's called a net casting spider. They don't weave a web as most spiders do. Instead, they weave this little net, a web that's in the shape of a net, or like a net, and they just hang by a thread, and they wait. And when an insect comes underneath here, they cast the web down on it, capture the insect, and eat it. So it's something that's a little bit different. Another couple of spiders in my backyard. This one obviously taken at night, hence the black background, taken at night with a flash. These are garden orb spiders, so they build a big orb-shaped web. This is the female, this is the male. Over a period of about 15 minutes, I guess, I watched. It started off with the female in the center of the web, and the male would very tentatively come in, try and make contact with her. This went on for quite a while until eventually they joined together, mating. And the thing that makes this a particularly unusual image is this little blue ball here. That's actually the ball of sperm. The male spider back ejects the ball of sperm into the atmosphere, and then maybe 15, 20 seconds later, the female actually takes up the ball of sperm. And then a few minutes later, this poor guy's on the ground dead. But again, something a little bit unusual. Any questions at this point?
Yes, Roy, did you stack the image of the spiders?
No, no, single shot.
It was just a depth of field you've got.
Yep, it was taken with a flash, obviously. And so because of the, I was relatively close to them, I was using a macro lens, and because of the amount of light from the flash, I was able to use a fairly small aperture on that, got the sufficient depth of field. That one got to the semi-finals in the BBC wildlife competition a few years ago.
Do you use tripod at all, Roy?
Not in that case, no. Normally with my nature stuff, I'm not using a tripod because things are happening all around you and you want to be able to move quickly. A lot of the stuff in Africa is the images are taken from a vehicle, so you can rest your vehicle on have a beanbag on the windowsill and do it that way. Okay, back to the sharing. We'd all like to think that nature photography was easy, but it's definitely not. Particularly if you're going to go somewhere, but even if you're doing it in your own backyard, you've got to do a bit of planning and you've got to prepare, and you certainly have to practice. And always try to learn from your experiences, what works, what doesn't work. And part of the learning is learning about the behavior of the things that you're photographing. With this bird on the right-hand side here, for example, the lilac-breasted roller, you can see there's a little branch here, and they tend to, these are South African birds, they tend to sit on a high point on a little bush, and then they'll fly off to grab an insect, and they come back to where they were before. They're quite territorial. And so if you can anticipate that they're going to come back to a particular point, then you can be focused on this point and wait for them to come back after they fly off, and rather than trying to focus on the moving bird. So my advice basically is, before you ever go out your back door or wherever, you really have to understand your equipment, whatever it is. I don't care what brand of camera you've got or how many lenses you've got or whatever. You've got to know how to use it, how to get the most out of whatever you have. You don't have to have the latest and greatest camera to get great shots. You've just got to have a camera that you can use efficiently. You've got to do research into location where you're going and the things you want to photograph. So if you're going somewhere to photograph birds, you've got to know what sort of birds are there and how do they behave and so on. And you've got to practice your techniques, practice the skills that you're going to need in the field before you ever get to the field. So if you go somewhere where you know you're going to be photographing animals that are going to be moving, you've got to practice photographing moving things so that you know that you can capture an image like the foxes here, where the subject's going to be clear in focus and so on. And obviously, if you're going to be doing macro work, you've got to understand how to get appropriate depth of field with your macro shots and so on. And these two images I've just used as examples of where the skills you need, the techniques you need to use are quite different for those two images. Yes, they're both point the camera and press the shutter, but the skills you need are quite different. And so you have to know what those skills are and develop them. Because being able to use your equipment is much more important than the specifications of that equipment. You know, how many megapixels you've got and how fast the shutter goes and all those sorts of things. They're relevant, but it's your ability to use the equipment that really counts. And just another two examples here of extremes, if you like, the macro shot versus the moving bird, different skills required, and you've got to practice those skills. You really do have to be totally familiar with your camera so that you're not out in the field scratching your head thinking, oh, gee, how do I adjust shutter speed or whatever? But not only how do you make the adjustments, but what effect do different things have? So it needs to be second nature when you're thinking about adjusting your aperture, for example. What effect is that going to have on depth of field with the particular lens that you're using and with a subject that's a particular distance away? If you want to freeze action, you know, it's not just a matter of saying, oh, I'll use 1,000th of a second shutter speed. Maybe you need 5,000th of a second, depending on what it is you're photographing. And this one's really crucial. I mentioned this briefly before. Understand how your camera behaves in relation to the ISO settings so that you get satisfactory results with noise. And it's not just a matter of always putting it on the lowest possible ISO. Because as I illustrated before, sometimes you have to increase the ISO in order to get the shutter speed you want or the aperture you want. And the important thing here, as far as ISO is concerned, is that you must know how your particular camera, not the model, but in general, but your own camera, how it behaves in relation to noise. And the only way you're going to find that out is to experiment. So what I suggest everybody does is take a series of images under different lighting conditions, early morning, plenty of sunlight in the day, cloudy day, dusk, and so on. Take a series of images at different ISO settings and work out the maximum limit of ISO that you can use under different lighting circumstances and still get satisfactory noise results, having in mind whatever noise reduction software you are using. And then when you're out in the field, you can be quite comfortable in a certain lighting condition saying to yourself, okay, I can easily take the ISO up to 5,000 and I'm still going to be getting good results. Or no, I can only take it up to 800 in these lighting conditions. You really have to understand that for your own particular equipment. And you've got to be thinking about whether you're going to use aperture priority, shutter priority, when is it best to use manual? These are things you've got to sort out well in advance. And your metering modes, depending on what sort of camera you've got, what they might call them, but basically spot metering, matrix metering, and so on. What do they mean for your camera? What difference is it going to make? And also the focus modes. You're going to take single shots or continuous. My recommendation for nature is always have your camera on continuous mode. So you fire a burst, not just one shot. And the BBF, for those not familiar, that's back button focus. If your camera is capable of back button focus, I suggest you set it up and use it. I won't go into details of what it is if you don't know. Just check out back button focus. It'll be a little bit awkward to use to start with, but once you use it, you'll get better results than you get from normal shutter release focus. And yeah, if you're using bursts, you've got to decide whether to use slow or fast. And these are things to work out for your own camera, what's going to give you the best results for the sort of things you use. This is just repeating what I said before about ISO. So it's a matter of how well your particular camera deals with noise. Common mistakes that I think people make when they're capturing nature images is, first of all, not understanding their subject. You know, regardless of what you're photographing, whether it's a grasshopper or an eagle or a kangaroo or whatever it is, if you understand what those things do, how they behave, what they eat, all those sorts of things, you'll be able to anticipate what the subject's likely to do in a given situation and get better results. You obviously got to understand your equipment, which I was just talking about. You got to be prepared before you go out in the field. You know, make sure you've got everything you need and you know how to use it, and you don't have to think about what you're doing in that regard. Don't make the mistake of leaving your camera on P for professional. Get it onto aperture mode, aperture priority or shutter priority or manual according to the situation that you're in. And don't think that you've always got to have it on one or, you know, aperture priority, for example. Sometimes that's best, sometimes it's not. Always shoot in RAW, which I hope you're all doing now. No point at all in shooting JPEG. As I mentioned before, for nature, burst mode all the time, not single. And make sure that you can get your camera to focus properly on what you're photographing. And if you have a camera which allows you to do what's referred to as micro adjustments of the focus, take the time to do that with each of the lenses you're going to use, so that your camera can automatically adjust the way it focuses to suit the lens that you're using. It can be a little bit fiddly setting it up, but once you've done it, then you'll be confident that even if you change lenses, your camera is still going to focus properly. And don't make the mistake of ignoring what's in the background. Sometimes you want the background to be as out of focus as possible and as unobtrusive as possible. But for nature, there will be other times where you really do want the background to be in focus as well as your subject, because the background is going to be an important part of the nature story that you're trying to tell. And then once you've captured all your wonderful images and you're editing them, a few mistakes to try to avoid. Don't put too much contrast in your images. And of course, these days, there's all sorts of ways of adjusting contrast on an image. It's not just a contrast slider, but adjustments like clarity sliders and dehaze sliders and so on will add contrast to your images. And you don't want to put too much contrast in, or your nature images start to look unnatural. Definitely don't oversaturate the images. Be very careful if you've photographed something like a parrot, for example, which has got very bright colors. You want to keep them natural, not oversaturated. I mentioned before, don't over sharpen your images, because that quickly becomes very obvious. Cropping, I haven't mentioned much about cropping other than the fact that you're allowed to do it, but the crop tool should be your best friend. Almost all nature images will need some cropping, and you need to work out exactly what you want to include in your image, what you want to exclude from the image, crop it appropriately. And obviously, when you're entering a competition, if it's a digital competition, the competition will specify pixel dimensions for your image. It might say the image can be no more than 1400 by 1050 pixels, or no more than 1920 by 1200 pixels, or some other numbers. Don't think that that's exactly how you have to crop your image. You crop your image to suit the content In other words, crop it so that your content is presented most effectively. And so long as the pixel dimensions are less than the maximum that's specified, then it doesn't matter what the aspect ratio of your image is, but always make sure that at least one of your dimensions, either the horizontal dimension or the vertical dimension, are at the maximum allowed. Otherwise, your image will appear small when it's being viewed by the judges, and that will be a disadvantage. And basically do whatever you need to do so your images look natural. Excuse me. And then finally, you got to have fun. If you stop having fun with your nature photography, you might as well start playing golf. And don't forget to share your stories. This is how big the lion was that nearly ate me, or whatever. So I'll stop there and see what questions we might have. Okay,
Wow.
over to you.
Wow, that was fantastic.
I picked up a couple of things. I can only remember one. In the olden days, when we used to take films out and have them developed, if we got one shot out of 36, which was reasonable, we've been very lucky.
Yep.
And I took your comment, 1 in 1,000 is all right too.
Yeah. I mean, I think everybody these days using digital gear takes many more photos than they did before. And that's okay. And I keep emphasizing to use burst mode for your nature images. It's simply taking advantage of what your camera can do and recognizing the fact that if you're photographing something that's either moving or likely to move, your chances of getting a good shot with just a one click are minimal. Whereas with burst mode, you can easily discard the ones that don't work.
What kit do you use, Roy?
Most of my gear is Nikon. Yeah.
The image you had of the rat in the hole with the eating the grass or whatever, would that have been an accepted image in one of the external, the salons? It was technically good, it was doing something, showed the environment. You think it would be?
Yeah. It's been accepted internationally. Yeah. What was your concern about it?
No, I wasn't concerned. I'm just thinking you were saying about the story, and it seems to me now that images that are accepted have always got to have things going on. There's so much going on in them. A bird on a stick, as you've said, is not good enough now, even if it's technically brilliant. It has to be something more than that.
That's correct. And also keep in mind, you've got the results you will get in international competitions depend very much on the knowledge and experience of the judges. So if a judge, say we'll use that little rat image as an example. If a judge particularly if they'd been in a situation where they had taken images like that themselves, they would understand what it was. It's a whistling rat. It's in a desert area. It digs a hole that lives in. It's eating this sort of food. So the image would tell much more of a story than if somebody looked at it and thought, "Oh, what's that? Is it a rat or a mouse? Why is all the sand around?" That, so. Unfortunately, you're stuck with that. The fact that the knowledge, experience of the judges will influence how they evaluate your images.
Yeah. Yes, I really enjoyed that. So much information. Excellent.
There is just one other point I would like to make. I said right at the beginning that PSA is very big on the idea that the welfare of the subject is more important than the photograph. And that's a message that I would like all of you to share with as many people as possible, because there are some terrible examples of what people do to living creatures in order to get photographs. And the PSA is clamping down on this in that if an image, if judges for whatever reason accept an image where it appears that these ethical boundaries have been crossed, the chairperson of that exhibition is contacted by PSA, told that they must inform the judges of the mistake that the judges have made. It doesn't negate the acceptance in the exhibition, but basically the organisers are told, if you allow this to happen again, PSA will not recognise your exhibition anymore.
Sorry, carry on.
I was just going to say, I can show you a couple of examples of these horrible things if you want to see them.
Mm-hmm.
Why not?
So that you can recognise the sort of thing that PSA is clamping down on. I'll just share the screen again.
How many acceptances would you need to get a more?
I don't know. I don't know.
I should have told you this before. If you go to the PSA website, which is this address at the top, psa-photo.org, from the menu, you can select divisions and then nature. And on that page of the PSA website, you'll find this document, a guide for nature division judges. Even though it's said called a guide for judges, it's also a guide for people who enter exhibitions. And it goes through in much greater detail than what I've done today to explain what is allowed and what is not allowed in nature exhibitions. It's quite a detailed document. I basically wrote the document in consultation with some other people in PSA. So that's well worth having a look at. If you want to have a look at some of my photography, that's my web address. And that's my email address if you want to email me about anything. And a bit of advertising here. I run an exhibition called the Lake Macquarie International Circuit. This year's circuit, the entries rather, don't close till the 1st of October. They're not open yet, but they'll be open in May. And it's got 6 different sections in it, including a nature and a wildlife section. So if you like entering international exhibitions, please enter this one. It's called a circuit because the images will get judged 3 times. You make one lot of entries, but there's all the images get judged 3 times.
Is it BPE and Fiat as well as PSA?
No, it's just PSA and also the Australian organisation. It's not.
Is the Australian one as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it hasn't got Fiat recognition. They charge a heap of money. Anyway, now I'm going to show you some images, and I'll make the point these are not my images. Now, the first time people see that image, they think, wow, isn't that fantastic? And then you have a look, what's happening here. This is a guinea fowl being fed to the tigers just so people can photograph the guinea fowl being killed by the tigers. This takes place in China. There's a place that calls itself a tiger research center or some stupid name like that. They have in captivity about 500 tigers, and photographers go there. General public can go as well, of course. Photographers go there and they pay according to what they want fed to the tigers. So it starts, the price list starts at the bottom of it is domestic fowls, and then guinea fowls and ducks and geese, and progresses up to goats and sheep and cattle. You can feed whatever you like to the tigers. Absolutely disgusting. PSA is in the process of banning all photographs taken at that place. That's the name of it. Yeah, Siberian Tiger Park in Harbin, China. So if you see an image like that and somebody says to you, isn't that fantastic? Just say, no, sorry, it's not actually.
But that wouldn't be allowed anyway because of the fences.
Oh yeah, it wouldn't be allowed as a nature image, but that PSA's restriction on the welfare of the subject being more important than photograph applies to all areas, not just nature. So if that image was put in a colour competition, for example, it's still breaching the rules. Some people will look at this image and say, wow, isn't that great? Until you look more closely at what's actually happening in this image. Sure, we've got a parent bird here feeding an insect to a chick, but look more closely. This chick and the one on the left are approximately the same size, therefore approximately the same age. The two in the middle are smaller. There's no way they all belong to the same nest of chicks. I actually queried the owner of this image and they were honest enough to admit to me what happens. This is taken in Indonesia at a place where there's a rainforest and people go into the rainforest, they take the chicks out of the nests, put them on a setup situation like this so that people can photograph them. What happens to the chicks after the photographs are taken? Nobody knows. But it's definitely not healthy for them. You can be sure of that. Okay, first time you see an image like this, you'll say, wow, isn't that fantastic? And in fact, an image very, very similar to this received an award in the British Nature Museum competition last year. The owner of this image admitted to me that the snake is fastened to the ground, so it can't get away. Right? Now, quite clearly, that is unethical behaviour. And they're just three examples of the sort of stuff that PSA is clamping down on. We can't, this one was taken in China as well. We can't change people's mindset worldwide. There are certain cultures and indeed certain people in any culture who believe that something like this is quite fine. Yeah, raptors eat snakes, so why not feed the snake to the raptor? But my view very, very strongly is that something like this is totally unethical. And so, yeah, I'm doing what I can to try to prevent images like this being accepted in international competitions.
I was making the point, we had Peter O'Brien a few weeks ago, and he was talking, about this as well. I made the point that a few years ago, there were so many pictures of kingfishers diving and getting fish and sitting on the pod on a branch with a little fish. Yep. There were so many images in all the, competitions and things. Obviously not now. I think everybody got fed up with kingfishers, but yeah, a few years ago, there were a lot of live fish being eaten by kingfishers for the sake of photographers.
They had fish tanks sunk into the water at the level, and they used to put the fish in the fish tank.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a kingfisher just dives down, gets the fish, and off you go.
Yeah. One of the most recent examples I've seen of that type of thing, not the kingfisher getting the fish, but it was a photograph of a baby crocodile taken underwater. And because of all of the bubbles and so on that was around it, it was obvious that the baby crocodile had been dropped or thrown into the water in a situation where it could be photographed through glass. And you might say, oh, it's only a damn crocodile. Who cares what happens to the crocodile? But the point is you are stressing or maybe even killing or injuring a living creature for the sake of a photograph. It's just not appropriate. Anyway, right. I'll get off my hobby horse. Yeah.
Right, I'm asking this question on behalf of my wife who's sitting here, and she is really heavily into nature photography and also has got several PSA awards. And I'm just wondering how many awards you would need to get to a situation where you get accreditation.
You don't need any. The PSA, I gather you're familiar with the FIAP distinction system, honor system, where you have to have a certain number of acceptances and a certain number of awards and so on. The PSA system is based entirely on acceptances.
Yeah.
So getting an award for an image doesn't make any difference in terms of your progress towards the PSA distinctions. It's based on just on acceptances, but also titles. There's at each level of the system, you have to have a certain number of acceptances that come from a minimum number of titles. So you can't, for example, it's pointless having one image that got 250 acceptances. You couldn't use all those to 250 acceptances. If you want to email me, I'm quite happy to send you a document that outlines the system in the basics of the system. And by the way, I think PSA is quite a good organisation to join, not only just to get the photographic distinctions and certainly to take advantage of acceptances that you might have gained on the way to FIAP distinctions, for example. But PSA has a lot of other things to offer, such as online courses. It has, at this stage, I think about a dozen different online courses, which you're not charged for those. You pay your membership, obviously, but then you can do the online courses without charge. And they range from everything from a basic Photoshop course up to courses that are basically designed to prepare people to be judges, and other courses that are designed to help people be successful in competitions. There's a still life course and a whole range of different courses. So that's one of the other benefits. There are also some companies that give discounts to PSA members on for photographic equipment and so on. So you can have a look at the PSA website, but also specifically in terms of the distinctions, I'm happy to help you with that because I was involved essentially with writing a lot of the rules for that.
Okay, thanks.
Are they changing, Roy? Because
Is
FIAP
what
are drastically changing theirs.
are the rules for distinctions?
No, the amount of
The number of acceptances has gone up in FIAP.
drastically.
Oh, right. No, the PSA system, the first level of distinction, which is called QPSA, requires just 54 acceptances, which have to come from at least 18 different images. And it progresses from there up to the top level, the Grandmaster's Platinum level, which needs about 11,000 acceptances or some crazy number like that. But the basic structure of the system hasn't changed for quite a few years and is unlikely to ever change. I mean, if it changes, it would be adding another level at the top. But there's only, I think, 3 people in the world that have ever got to the top level. Yeah.
Yeah, no, FIAP are drastically changing theirs.
Yeah, no, PSA's got no plans at all to change the requirements of the levels that are already there, the distinction levels that are already there. It's if you're familiar with FIAP and you decide to pursue the PSA path, at first to put it bluntly,